The emergency siren screamed across the research station as Dr. Sarah Chen pressed her back against the metal wall, clutching the emergency kit to her chest. Through the thick observation window, she could see the orange flames licking at the outer hull of the xenobiology lab. The Kythera nest was burning, and everything she had worked for over the past 3 years was about to turn to ash. Sarah had been the only human on Station Kepler 442b for 18 months now. The other researchers had been recalled when the political situation between Earth and the Galactic Federation grew tense. But Sarah refused to leave. The Kythera were too important, too misunderstood. These creatures that the galaxy feared as ultimate predators were so much more complex than anyone realized. The station shuddered as another explosion rocked the lower levels. Through her communicator, she could hear Captain Morrison's voice crackling with static from the evacuation ship hovering outside the atmosphere. Dr. Chen, you have 12 minutes before we lose orbital window. The Zephyrian attack fleet will be here in 40 minutes. We cannot wait any longer. Sarah knew the Zephyrians were coming. They had declared the Kythera research stations a threat to galactic security. In their minds, any attempt to study or understand the Kythera was tantamount to breeding weapons of mass destruction. They were wrong, but try explaining that to a species that had lost 3 entire colonies to Kythera swarms 2 centuries ago. The problem was that nobody understood what Sarah had discovered. The Kythera weren't just mindless predators. They were intelligent, emotional, and capable of forming bonds that transcended species barriers. More importantly, they were dying. Their homeworld had been strip-mined by corporate interests, their breeding grounds poisoned by industrial waste. The few surviving populations were scattered across research stations like this one, and now even those sanctuaries were being destroyed. Another explosion, closer this time. Sarah felt the floor vibrate beneath her feet as emergency lighting bathed the corridor in red. She had to make a choice. She could run to the evacuation pod and save herself, or she could do something that would probably get her killed but might save an entire species. The nursery was 3 levels down, in the most heavily shielded part of the station. If the fire hadn't reached there yet, the 5 cubs she had been raising might still be alive. They were barely 6 weeks old, no bigger than house cats, but already showing the intelligence and curiosity that marked their species. Sarah had watched them learn to communicate with simple gestures, had seen them comfort each other when they were afraid, had felt their tiny claws gently grip her fingers when she fed them. She ran. The corridors were filling with smoke now, and the artificial gravity was fluctuating. Sarah pulled on her emergency respirator as she descended the maintenance ladders. The elevator systems had failed when the power grid took damage, but she knew every inch of this station. She had walked these halls for 3 years, studying, learning, and falling in love with creatures that the rest of the galaxy wanted to see extinct. The nursery door was still sealed, its biolocks intact. Sarah pressed her palm to the scanner and held her breath. The lock disengaged with a soft click, and she pushed inside. The cubs were huddled together in the far corner of their enclosure, their silver fur standing on end with fear. When they saw Sarah, they made the soft chirping sounds that meant safety, home, mother. She had taught them to make that sound when they saw her, just as she had learned to make their greeting clicks with her tongue. "It's okay, babies," she whispered, climbing into the enclosure. "We're going to get out of here." The cubs were small enough that she could carry all 5 if she was careful. She had practiced this evacuation scenario in her head dozens of times, though she had never imagined she would actually need to do it. She arranged the cubs carefully in the special carrier she had designed, a modified emergency suit that would keep them warm and provide them with the specific atmospheric mixture they needed to survive. As she worked, the station shook again. This time she could hear the grinding sound of metal being torn apart. The outer hull was breaching in multiple locations now. She had maybe 5 minutes before the entire structure collapsed. The cubs seemed to understand the danger. They pressed against each other and made soft, questioning sounds. Sarah had been working on translating their simple language for months, and she was pretty sure they were asking if the safe place was ending. Her heart broke a little as she fastened the carrier straps around her chest. "The safe place is moving," she told them in their own clicking language. "We go to new safe place together." The journey back to the upper levels was a nightmare. The maintenance shafts were filling with smoke, and twice Sarah had to detour around sections where the hull had already breached. The cubs were silent now, sensing her fear and responding with the stillness that was their species' instinct when hiding from danger. Sarah's respirator was running low on oxygen by the time she reached the evacuation level. Her lungs burned, and her eyes streamed tears from the smoke. Through the observation window, she could see the Zephyrian fleet approaching, their ships dark against the stars. They would arrive soon, and when they did, they would finish what the fire had started. The evacuation pod was still docked, its engines humming with readiness. Captain Morrison's voice crackled through the comm system as Sarah stumbled toward the airlock. "Sarah, thank God. We thought you were dead. Get in here now. We launch in 30 seconds with or without you." Sarah hesitated at the threshold of the pod. Once she stepped inside, there would be no going back. She would be taking 5 Cathara cubs away from the only world they had ever known, into a galaxy that wanted them dead. She would be risking not just her career, but her life, and probably the lives of everyone on the evacuation ship. But when she looked down at the cubs nestled against her chest, their large eyes looking up at her with complete trust, she knew she had no choice. Someone had to speak for the species that couldn't speak for themselves. Someone had to save the children, even if they were the children of creatures that others called monsters. She stepped into the pod, just as the station's main reactor went critical behind them. The evacuation ship Meridian lurched as Captain Morrison pushed the engines beyond their safety limits. Behind them, Station Kepler 442b erupted in a ball of white-hot plasma as the reactor core breached. Sarah felt the heat wash over the ship's shields even through the thick hull plating. "Jesus Christ, Sarah," Morrison muttered, his knuckles white on the control yoke. "You cut that close even for you?" Sarah barely heard him. She was focused on the 5 small forms pressed against her chest, their tiny hearts beating so fast she could feel them through the carrier fabric. The cubs had gone completely silent during the explosion, their survival instincts kicking in. In the wild, young Cathara would freeze like this during storms or when adult predators passed nearby. Dr. James Walsh, the expedition's chief medical officer, approached with a scanner in his hands. His face was grim as he looked at Sarah's improvised carrier. "Sarah, what exactly are you carrying there?" She met his eyes steadily. "The future of an entire species." Walsh's scanner beeped softly as he ran it over the carrier. His expression shifted from confusion to alarm as the readings came back. "These are Cathara cubs, 5 of them." He looked up at Morrison, then back at Sarah. "Do you have any idea what you've done? We're carrying the most dangerous predators in known space, and they're babies, which means they're going to grow." Morrison's voice carried over the engine noise. "Sarah, please tell me you have a plan here. Because we've got 6 hours to reach the jump point, and then we're in neutral space with no backup and no support." Sarah carefully unstrapped the carrier and set it down on the medical bay's examination table. Through the transparent front panel, she could see the cubs beginning to stir. The largest one, a female she had named Arya, was looking around with alert silver eyes. "They're not dangerous," Sarah said firmly. "That's what I've been trying to prove for 3 years. The Cathara aren't mindless killers. They're intelligent, social, and capable of forming emotional bonds with other species, including humans." Walsh shook his head.
"Sarah, I've read the reports from the colony wars. These things tore through 3 planets like tissue paper."
"They killed millions. Those were wild adults protecting their territory from invaders," Sarah replied. "These are cubs that I've raised from birth. They know me. They trust me. And more importantly, they're the last chance we have to prove that coexistence is possible." As if to demonstrate her point, Arya made a soft chirping sound and pressed her tiny paw against the carrier's front panel. Sarah reached over and gently touched the spot where the paw rested. Immediately, the cub began making the rapid clicking sounds that meant happiness and recognition. Morrison's voice interrupted the moment. "We've got incoming communication from the Zephyrian fleet. They're demanding that we submit to inspection." Sarah felt her stomach drop. If the Zephyrians found the cubs, they would be killed instantly. The Zephyrian Empire had a standing kill order on all Cathara specimens, no exceptions. They considered the species too dangerous to exist anywhere in the galaxy. "Can we outrun them?" she asked. Morrison laughed bitterly. "In this rust bucket? Not a chance. Zephyrian interceptors can do 0.8 light speed. We're lucky if we hit 0.4. Walsh was still studying his scanner readings. "Sarah, these cubs. According to this data, they're not entirely Cathara." Sarah frowned. "What do you mean?" "Their genetic structure has been modified. Look at these protein markers." He showed her the display. "Someone has been doing gene therapy on them. Their aggression inhibitors have been enhanced. and their social bonding capacity has been increased by nearly 40%. Sarah stared at the readings. She had suspected something like this for months. The cubs were far more social and affectionate than any of the wild Cathera footage she had studied. But she had assumed it was because they had been raised in captivity. Who would do something like that? Morrison asked. The original research team, Sarah realized. Dr. Yamoto and her colleagues. They weren't just studying the Cathera. They were trying to engineer a peaceful subspecies. The ship's communication system crackled to life. A harsh Zephyrian voice filled the cabin, speaking in the clipped mechanical tones of their translator implants. Human vessel Meridian. You will prepare for immediate boarding and inspection. Any attempt to flee will result in your destruction. Morrison looked at Sarah. Orders? Sarah looked down at the cubs, who were now all awake and looking around with curious eyes. They had never seen the inside of a spaceship before, but they weren't afraid. They trusted her to keep them safe, just as they had trusted her to carry them out of the burning station. Run, she said quietly. Morrison grinned. I was hoping you'd say that. He slammed the throttle forward, and the Meridian leaped toward the jump point. Behind them, the Zephyrian ships began their pursuit, their sleek forms cutting through space like silver bullets. Sarah could see them on the rear display, growing larger by the minute. Walsh had opened the carrier and was gently examining each cub with his scanner. They're in good health, he reported. A little stressed from the evacuation, but no injuries. Their modifications seemed stable. The largest cub, Arya, was trying to climb out of the carrier. Sarah carefully lifted her out and held her against her shoulder. The cub immediately began grooming Sarah's hair with her tiny tongue. A behavior that Sarah had learned meant deep affection and trust. They're beautiful, Walsh said softly, his earlier fear forgotten as he watched the gentle interaction. They are, Sarah agreed. And they're the proof that the galaxy needs to see. The Cathera don't have to be our enemies. With the right approach, the right understanding, they could be our partners. Morrison's voice carried a note of strain. Sarah, you better hope you're right about that. Because we've got company closing fast and I don't think they're interested in a peaceful conversation. On the display, Sarah could see the lead Zephyrian interceptor closing to weapons range. Soon they would be firing and the old cargo hauler wouldn't be able to take much damage. But Sarah wasn't afraid. For the first time in months, she felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. She was carrying the future in her arms, and no matter what happened next, she was going to fight for it. The cubs seemed to sense her determination. All 5 of them were looking at her now, their large eyes bright with intelligence and trust. They didn't understand the danger they were in, but they understood that their human mother would protect them, and Sarah would. Even if it killed her. The first energy blast struck the Meridian's rear shields, sending the ship spinning through space like a thrown stone. Sarah clutched Arya tightly as the artificial gravity fluctuated, while the other 4 cubs tumbled around in their carrier, squeaking in alarm. Shields down to 60%, Morrison called out, fighting to regain control. These guys aren't messing around. Dr. Walsh grabbed the carrier and strapped it securely to the medical bay's emergency restraints. Sarah, we need to talk about what happens if they board us. Sarah knew what he meant. The Zephyrians would kill the cubs on sight. Their fear of the Cathera ran so deep that they considered even studying the species to be an act of war. To them, what Sarah was doing was equivalent to breeding bioweapons. There has to be somewhere we can hide them, she said, still holding Arya close. The cub was making soft distress sounds, picking up on the tension in the air. Another blast shook the ship. This time the lights flickered and stayed dim. Power couplings damaged, Morrison reported. We've lost 20% of our speed. On the view screen, Sarah could see 3 Zephyrian interceptors closing in formation. Their ships were elegant and deadly, built for speed and precision strikes. The Meridian was a 50-year-old cargo hauler that had been converted for research use. It was never meant for combat. Walsh was studying the ship's schematics on his tablet. There's a maintenance crawl space behind the water recycling systems. It's shielded and temperature-controlled. The cubs could survive there for a few hours. Sarah shook her head. They're too young to be separated from me for that long. They'll panic and start calling for help. The Zephyrians will hear them. It was true. The cubs had never been away from Sarah for more than an hour since they were born. She was the only mother they had ever known, and their distress calls when separated from her were loud enough to be heard through hull plating. Morrison's voice was tight with concentration as he threw the ship into another evasive maneuver. Whatever we're going to do, we need to decide fast. I've got 2 more ships coming up from the port side. Sarah looked down at Arya, who was looking back at her with those intelligent silver eyes. The cub seemed to understand that something important was happening. She reached up with one tiny paw and touched Sarah's cheek, making the soft clicking sound that meant concern and affection. In that moment, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. "Open a channel to the Zephyrian ships," she said. Morrison almost choked. "Are you insane?" "Just do it." The view screen shimmered and resolved into the image of a Zephyrian commander. The alien's face was all sharp angles and metallic implants, with cold yellow eyes that seemed to look right through Sarah. When he spoke, his voice was like grinding metal. "Human, you will surrender immediately and prepare for boarding. We know you carry Kythera specimens." Sarah stepped into view of the camera, still holding Arya in her arms. The cub was curious about the strange face on the screen and made a questioning chirp. "Commander, my name is Dr. Sarah Chen. You're right that I'm carrying Kythera, 5 cubs that I rescued from the burning research station. But before you destroy us, I want you to see something." The commander's eyes narrowed. "There is nothing to see. The Kythera are a plague upon the galaxy. They must be eliminated." "Look at her," Sarah said, gently turning Arya so the camera could see her face. "Really look." Arya, with the natural curiosity of a young creature, was fascinated by the alien on the screen. She made a series of soft clicks and chirps trying to communicate with the strange new face. "She's trying to talk to you," Sarah said. "A wild Kythera would have been hissing and spitting by now. But she's been raised with love and care. She sees you as a potential friend, not an enemy." The commander's expression didn't change, but Sarah noticed that he didn't immediately cut the transmission. Walsh stepped into view beside Sarah. "Commander, I'm Dr. James Walsh, Chief Medical Officer. I've just completed scans of these cubs. They've been genetically modified to enhance their social bonding capabilities and reduce their aggressive tendencies. They represent a new subspecies that could coexist peacefully with other galactic species." "Lies," the commander spat. "Kythera cannot be changed. They are killers by nature." Sarah set Arya down on the examination table, where the cub immediately began exploring the new space with playful curiosity. She grabbed a small toy, a simple puzzle cube that Sarah had made for the cub's enrichment, and began manipulating it with her paws. "Watch her solve this," Sarah said. "Wild Kythera don't play. They don't explore for the joy of discovery, but these cubs do." On screen, they could see Arya working through the puzzle with intense concentration. Her little tongue stuck out slightly as she figured out how to rotate the colored segments. When she finally solved it, she looked up at the camera and made a triumphant chirping sound, as if seeking approval. For the first time, the Zephyrian commander's expression wavered slightly. Dr. Walsh pulled up the genetic analysis on his tablet. "Commander, I'm transmitting our full research data to your ship. The modifications to these cubs are stable and hereditary. A breeding population of peaceful Kythera could be established within 2 generations. Another of the cubs, a smaller male that Sarah had named Echo, had climbed out of the carrier and was now grooming Arya's fur. It was a tender, familial gesture that spoke of deep emotional bonds between the siblings. Your people lost millions to the Kythera Wars, Sarah said quietly. So did humanity. So did every species in the Federation. But that doesn't mean the cycle of violence has to continue forever. These cubs represent hope. They represent the possibility of peace. The transmission was silent for a long moment. Sarah could see other Zephyrian officers gathered behind their commander, watching the cubs with expressions that ranged from curiosity to fear. Finally, the commander spoke. Even if what you say is true, how can we be certain that these modifications are permanent? How do we know they will not revert to their savage nature? Walsh answered immediately. The modifications are at the genetic level, Commander. They affect the cub's brain chemistry and hormone production. It would be like asking if you might suddenly revert to being a different species. Sarah picked up Arya again, who immediately snuggled against her shoulder. Commander, I've spent 3 years with these creatures. I've watched them grow from helpless infants into intelligent, loving beings. They're not weapons. They're children. The commander's yellow eyes fixed on Sarah with laser intensity. And you would stake your life on this belief? I already have, Sarah replied. I'm here, aren't I? Morrison chose that moment to interrupt. Folks, we've got a problem. Long-range sensors are picking up a Federation battle group jumping in system. 8 to 12 minutes. The political situation had just become exponentially more complicated. If the Federation forces found the Zephyrians in this system, it could spark the war that both sides had been trying to avoid. The commander seemed to realize this as well. His expression hardened again. The Federation cannot be allowed to capture Kythera specimens. If you will not surrender them to us, we will destroy your ship before the Federation arrives. Sarah felt her heart sink, but then Arya did something unexpected. The cub looked directly at the camera and made a sound that Sarah had never heard before. It was complex and musical, almost like singing. The effect on the Zephyrian commander was immediate and startling. His eyes widened and he leaned forward in his chair. "What was that sound?" he demanded. Sarah was as surprised as he was. "I don't know. She's never made that sound before." Walsh was frantically checking his recordings. "It's not in any of our behavioral databases. This is completely new." On the screen, they could see the Zephyrian commander conferring rapidly with his officers in their own language. Finally, he turned back to the camera. "Dr. Chen, that sound? It is the Kythera greeting song. We have records of it from before the wars, when there was still hope for peaceful contact. No Kythera has sung that song in over 200 years. Sarah looked down at Arya with wonder. The little cub looked back at her and sang the strange, beautiful song again. The silence that followed Arya's song seemed to stretch across the vast emptiness of space. Sarah could see the Zephyrian commander struggling with something, his rigid posture wavering as centuries of hatred warred with a memory of what might have been. "Commander Valix," one of his officers said in heavily accented standard, "the Federation ships will be in weapons range in 8 minutes. We must make a decision." Commander Valix, Sarah finally had a name to put to the harsh face, was still staring at Arya with an expression of confused wonder. The little cub had begun grooming herself, completely unaware of the monumental impact her song had just created. "That song," Valak said slowly, "was recorded by our first diplomatic mission to the Kythera homeworld, 300 years ago. Our xenolinguists believed it was a greeting of friendship, an invitation to peaceful contact. When the wars began, we assumed we had been wrong." Dr. Walsh stepped closer to the camera. "Commander, what if you weren't wrong? What if the wars started because of a misunderstanding, not because of inherent Kythera aggression?" Sarah felt pieces of a puzzle clicking together in her mind. The mining operations on their homeworld, the corporate fleets that stripped their breeding grounds. What if the Kythera weren't attacking our colonies? What if they were refugees looking for new homes and we treated them as invaders? Morrison's voice cut through their discussion like a knife. "Philosophical debate time is over. Federation ships are powering weapons. Whatever we're going to do, we need to do it now." On the tactical display, Sarah could see the approaching Federation battle group, 3 heavy cruisers and a destroyer, all flying the colors of Earth's colonial defense force. They had probably been dispatched to investigate the destruction of the research station. Commander Valak seemed to make up his mind. "Dr. Chen, we will escort your ship to neutral space. But understand this. If your cubs show any sign of reverting to their ancestral nature, we will not hesitate to act." "You won't need to," Sarah said firmly. "They're not their ancestors. They're something new." The Zephyrian ships fell into formation around the meridian, their sleek forms providing an unlikely escort. Sarah could barely believe it was happening. For the first time in over 2 centuries, Zephyrian and human ships were flying together instead of shooting at each other. But their relief was short-lived. The Federation ships had locked onto their position and were demanding answers. "Unknown vessels, this is Captain Rodriguez of the CDF cruiser Defiance. Identify yourselves and explain your presence in this system." Morrison looked at Sarah questioningly. She nodded and he opened a channel. "Captain Rodriguez, this is Dr. Sarah Chen aboard the research vessel Meridian. We are evacuating critical xenobiological specimens from the destroyed research station. Dr. Chen, our records show you were ordered to evacuate 18 months ago. Why are you still in this system?" Sarah took a deep breath. "Because I discovered something that changes everything we thought we knew about the Kythera." The response was immediate and angry. The Kythera research program was terminated by direct order of the Colonial Senate. "Any specimens should have been destroyed." "I couldn't do that," Sarah said simply. "Not when I knew they were intelligent, emotional beings capable of peaceful coexistence." There was a long pause. When Captain Rodriguez spoke again, his voice was cold. "Dr. Chen, you are in violation of Senate Resolution 2387. You will surrender your specimens immediately and submit to arrest." Commander Valex's voice cut across the channel. Federation vessel. The specimens are under Zephyrian protection. Any attempt to board or destroy the research vessel will be considered an act of war. Sarah could see the tension ratcheting up by the second. The Federation and the Zephyrians had been on the brink of war for months, and now 5 tiny cubs were about to push them over the edge. But then Arya did something that changed everything again. She looked at the camera displaying Captain Rodriguez's face and began to sing. Not just the greeting song this time, but something more complex, more musical. The other cubs, hearing their sister's voice, joined in one by one until all 5 were singing together in perfect harmony. The sound was haunting and beautiful, unlike anything any of them had ever heard. It spoke of loss and longing, of hope and homecoming. It was a lament for a world that was gone and a prayer for a future that might still be possible. Dr. Walsh was recording frantically. "Sarah, do you realize what this is? They're not just mimicking sounds they've heard. They're composing, creating new music. This level of artistic expression indicates cognitive development, far beyond what we've observed in any other species." Captain Rodriguez's voice, when it came back, was much quieter. "Dr. Chen, are you saying these creatures are sentient?" "More than sentient," Sarah replied. "They're sapient. They have language, culture, emotional bonds, artistic expression, everything that we use to define intelligent life." She could see the Federation ships maintaining their position, but their weapons were no longer powered. The song had done what words could not. It had forced everyone to see the cubs not as monsters, but as children. Commander Valex spoke up again. "Captain Rodriguez, I propose a meeting. Not between our governments, but between scientists. Let our xenobiologists examine these cubs together. Let us determine the truth about their nature." It was an unprecedented offer. Zephyrian and Federation scientists had not worked together since before the Cathera Wars. "I would need authorization from my superiors," Rodriguez said slowly. "As would I," Valex admitted. "But some decisions are too important to wait for bureaucrats." Sarah felt a surge of hope. For the first time, she could see a path forward that didn't end in death or imprisonment. "There's a neutral research station in the Kepler 186 system," she said. "It's run by the Independent Scientists Coalition. No military presence, no political affiliations. We could all meet there." Morrison pulled up the navigation charts. "It's a 4-day jump from here, well within our range." Dr. Walsh was still analyzing the cub's song. "Sarah, I'm detecting patterns in their vocalizations that suggest they're trying to communicate specific concepts. I think they understand what's happening here better than we realize." As if to prove his point, Echo, the smallest of the cubs, climbed out of the carrier and walked directly to the camera. He looked straight into the lens and made a series of soft, questioning chirps that sounded remarkably like he was asking, "Friends?" The effect was electric. Sarah could see it in the faces on both view screens, the moment when trained military officers stopped seeing monsters and started seeing children. Captain Rodriguez was the first to break the silence. "Commander Valex, I believe your suggestion has merit. I'm willing to participate in a joint scientific expedition to evaluate these specimens." "As am I," Valex replied. "But I propose we stop calling them specimens. If they are truly sapient, they deserve better than that." Sarah smiled as she gathered the cubs back into their carrier. "Their names are Arya, Echo, Nova, Sage, and Ripple. And yes, they definitely deserve better than specimens." As the unlikely convoy set course for Kepler 186, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. 5 small cubs had just accomplished what diplomats and politicians had failed to do for centuries. They had brought ancient enemies together in the name of understanding. But Sarah also knew this was just the beginning. The real test would come when they reached the research station, when the cubs would be examined and evaluated by experts from both sides. Would the scientists see what she saw? Would they recognize the potential for a new future? Or would fear and prejudice win out in the end? Looking down at the 5 small faces peering up at her with complete trust, Sarah made a silent promise. Whatever happened next, she would fight for them. They had already proven they were worth fighting for. The Independent Research Station Harmony was a marvel of neutral engineering, floating in the asteroid belt of Kepler 186 like a crystal flower blooming in the darkness. Its rotating habitation rings and gleaming observation domes had housed scientists from dozens of species over the past 50 years. all united by the simple goal of advancing knowledge without the interference of politics or war. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the station's director, met them at the main airlock with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. She was a small woman with prematurely gray hair and eyes that had seen too much of the galaxy's troubles. But when she looked at the carrier containing the 5 cubs, those eyes lit up with scientific curiosity. Dr. Chen, I've read all your research papers. When I received the joint request from both Federation and Zephyrian Command, I thought it was some kind of elaborate hoax. Sarah carefully transferred the cubs to a mobile habitat unit that had been prepared for them. The little ones were tired from the 4-day journey but alert and curious about their new surroundings. Uria, always the most adventurous, was already pressing her face against the transparent walls, studying the new environment with bright eyes. Dr. Vasquez, meet my colleagues, Sarah said, gesturing to the mixed group of scientists that had assembled in the station's main laboratory. Dr. James Walsh from the Federation, and Dr. Keth Silvius from the Zephyrian Empire. Dr. Silvius was unlike any Zephyrian Sarah had ever met. Where most of his species favored cybernetic implants and metallic modifications, he appeared almost entirely organic, with the natural scaled skin and luminous eyes of his people. His voice, when he spoke, carried the musical undertones of unmodified Zephyrian vocal cords. Dr. Chen, I have studied your work for many years, even when my government declared it heretical. I volunteered for this mission because I believe the truth is more important than comfortable lies. The examination process began immediately. Each cub was carefully scanned, their genetics analyzed, their behavior recorded. Sarah watched nervously as the scientists poked and prodded her charges, but the cubs seemed to enjoy the attention. They chirped and played, showing off their intelligence and curiosity for their new audience. Dr. Walsh was particularly fascinated by their modified brain chemistry. The changes are even more extensive than I initially thought. Their amygdala, the fear and aggression center, has been almost completely restructured. But it's not just reduced function, it's been replaced with enhanced neural pathways for empathy and social bonding. Dr. Silvius was studying their vocalizations with equipment Sarah had never seen before. These songs they sing, they're not random. There's a linguistic structure here that's remarkably similar to ancient Zephyrian musical poetry. But the complexity suggests they're not just mimicking. They're creating new compositions in real time. As if to demonstrate, Nova and Sage began singing together, their voices weaving in and out of harmony in a pattern that was clearly improvised but hauntingly beautiful. Dr. Vasquez wiped tears from her eyes as she listened. In 50 years of xenobiology, I've never heard anything like that, she whispered. The real breakthrough came on the 3rd day, when Dr. Silvius made a discovery that stunned everyone. He was analyzing the genetic modifications when his equipment detected something unexpected. These changes, he announced to the assembled team, they're not random alterations. They're reversions, Sarah frowned. What do you mean? Dr. Silvius pulled up a holographic display showing the cub's genetic structure alongside samples from wild Cathera and ancient fossil records. The aggressive traits that we associate with modern Cathera, they're evolutionary adaptations that developed over the past 1,000 years. These cubs have been modified to match the original Cathera genome from before their world was industrialized. The implications hit everyone, simultaneously. Dr. Walsh was the first to voice what they were all thinking. You're saying the Cathera weren't naturally aggressive? That the violence was a response to environmental pressure? Exactly, Dr. Silvius confirmed. When their homeworld was strip-mined and polluted, the Cathera that survived were the ones with enhanced aggression and territorial instincts. Over generations, those traits became dominant in the population, but the original species was peaceful, social, and highly intelligent. Sarah felt vindicated but also deeply sad. So the Cathera that attacked our colonies weren't monsters. They were desperate refugees with nowhere else to go, driven to violence by centuries of environmental trauma. Dr. Vasquez was reviewing the historical records. The timeline fits. The corporate mining operations began 800 years ago. The first Cathera attacks on colonies were recorded 200 years later, after their world was essentially uninhabitable. The cubs, oblivious to the profound implications of the discussion happening around them, had discovered a collection of puzzle toys that Dr. Vasquez had provided. They were working together to solve increasingly complex problems. chattering to each other in their musical language and celebrating each success with joyful chirping. Echo, the smallest cub, had figured out how to open a multi-level maze toy and was teaching the others how to navigate it. His patience and clear communication skills were remarkable for such a young creature. "Look at that," Dr. Walsh said in wonder. "He's not just solving the puzzle himself. He's actively teaching the others. That level of cooperative learning indicates abstract reasoning capabilities." Dr. Silvius was recording everything. "Among my people, we have legends of the song speakers, ancient Kithara that could communicate across vast distances through music. We thought they were mythical, but now," as if summoned by his words, all 5 cubs suddenly stopped playing and turned toward the observation windows. They began singing together, a complex harmony that seemed to carry longing and sadness. Sarah followed their gaze and saw what had caught their attention: the view of space beyond the station, where stars glittered like scattered diamonds against the black. "They're singing to the stars," Dr. Vasquez breathed. "It's like they know their people are out there somewhere." The moment was interrupted by an urgent communication from the station's control center. Commander Valix and Captain Rodriguez appeared on the main display, both looking grim. "Doctors, we have a problem," Rodriguez began. "Word of this joint expedition has leaked to the press. Both our governments are under enormous pressure to end the project immediately." Commander Valix nodded grimly. "The Zephyrian High Council has ordered me to terminate the Cubs and return home. They consider my participation in this project to be treasonous. The Federation Colonial Senate isn't much better," Rodriguez added. "They're threatening to court-martial anyone involved in illegal xenobiological research." Sarah felt her heart sink. Just when they were making breakthrough discoveries, politics was going to destroy everything again. But Dr. Silvius stood up, his scaled skin flushing with the deep purple color that indicated strong emotion in his species. "Then perhaps it is time to stop asking permission from politicians who would rather maintain their comfortable hatreds than face uncomfortable truths." Dr. Vasquez was nodding slowly. "The Independent Scientists Coalition has protocols for exactly this situation. We can declare the research a matter of galactic scientific importance and invoke Article 7 of the Neutral Research Accords." Sarah wasn't familiar with the legal details, but Dr. Walsh was grinning. "Elena, that would make this station sovereign scientific territory. Neither government could legally interfere with the research. It would also make us all criminals in the eyes of our respective governments," Dr. Silvius pointed out. "We would be choosing science over citizenship." Sarah looked down at the cubs, who had stopped singing and were now looking at the adults with what seemed like understanding. Arya climbed up Sarah's arm and perched on her shoulder, making soft, comforting sounds. "Some choices aren't really choices at all," Sarah said quietly. "These cubs represent the possibility of peace between species that have been at war for centuries. How can we let politicians destroy that for the sake of maintaining the status quo?" Dr. Vasquez activated the station's emergency communication system. "Commander Valix, Captain Rodriguez, I'm invoking Article 7 as of this moment. This research will continue under the protection of the Neutral Research Accords, with or without government approval." On the display, both military officers exchanged glances. Then Commander Valix did something unprecedented. He smiled, an expression Sarah had never seen on a Zephyrian face before. "Dr. Vasquez, my government may court-martial me for this, but I formally request asylum on your station. The truth is more important than my career." Captain Rodriguez laughed. "Well, if he's staying, I guess I am too. My superiors are going to love this." As the implications of their decision sank in, the cubs began singing again. This time their song was different, lighter, more hopeful. It sounded like a celebration, like children who sensed that the adults had finally made the right choice. Sarah realized that in trying to save 5 small cubs, they had accidentally started a revolution. The question now was whether the galaxy was ready for the truth they were about to reveal. 3 months after declaring independence from their respective governments, the research team on Harmony Station had become the most wanted scientists in the galaxy, but they had also become the most celebrated, as word of their discoveries spread through underground scientific networks and independent media outlets. The Cubs, now significantly larger and more active, had transformed from research subjects into active participants in their own study. They had learned to communicate through a combination of their natural musical language and simple standard gestures that Dr. Silvius had developed. Their intelligence continued to astound everyone who worked with them. Sarah watched through the observation window as Arya, now the size of a large dog, worked with Dr. Walsh on a complex mathematical puzzle. The young Kythera had developed an intuitive understanding of geometry that surpassed many graduate students. She could visualize three-dimensional structures and manipulate them in her mind with remarkable precision. "She's not just intelligent," Dr. Walsh said, his voice filled with wonder. "She's brilliant. Look at how she's approaching this topology problem. She's finding solutions that our computers missed." In another part of the expanded habitat, Echo was teaching a group of visiting xenobiologists the basics of Kythera musical language. His patience and clear communication had made him a natural teacher, and his lessons were being recorded and transmitted to universities throughout the galaxy. But it was Nova who had provided the most shocking discovery. 2 weeks ago, she had begun exhibiting what could only be described as psychic abilities. She could sense the emotional states of humans and other species from across the room, and had even demonstrated limited telepathic communication with her siblings. Dr. Silvius was studying brain scans of all 5 cubs when he made the announcement that changed everything. "The psychic abilities aren't random mutations," he said, addressing the assembled team. "They're developmental stages. According to these readings, all Kythera cubs should develop these capabilities as they mature. It's part of their natural cognitive evolution." Dr. Vasquez looked up from her data analysis. "Are you saying that the adult Kythera we've been fighting for centuries have psychic abilities? That would explain how they coordinated their attacks so effectively." "More than that," Dr. Silvius continued. "I believe the original Kythera were a collective intelligence. Not a hive mind, but a species capable of sharing thoughts and emotions across vast distances. The trauma of losing their homeworld may have damaged this ability in the wild populations." Sarah felt pieces of the puzzle falling into place. "That's why the cubs sing to the stars. They're trying to reach other Kythera, but there's no one left who can hear them." The implications were staggering. Humanity and the other galactic civilizations hadn't just been fighting an intelligent species. They had been fighting a telepathic collective intelligence that was probably trying to communicate with them the entire Taranum. The breakthrough came when Sage, the most contemplative of the cubs, approached the team with what appeared to be a deliberate attempt at complex communication. She had arranged colored tiles in an intricate pattern and was singing a specific sequence of notes while pointing at different sections of the design. Dr. Silvius worked feverishly to decode the pattern. After 6 hours of analysis, he looked up with tears streaming down his scaled face. "It's a star map," he whispered. "She's showing us where the surviving Kythera populations are located." The map was incredibly detailed, marking 17 different systems where small groups of Kythera might still exist. Some were in Federation space, others in Zephyrian territory, and a few were in the neutral zones between empires. "But how could she know this?" Dr. Walsh asked. "She's never been off this station." Nova, who had been quietly listening to the conversation, approached and placed her paw on Dr. Walsh's hand. Suddenly his eyes went wide with shock. "I can hear them," he said in amazement. "There are voices, distant but real. They're calling out across space looking for their lost children." The psychic connection lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough to confirm what they had suspected. The Kythera weren't extinct. Scattered populations were hiding throughout the galaxy, probably traumatized and afraid, but still alive. Dr. Vasquez was already planning the next phase of their research. "We need to make contact with these populations. If we can prove that peaceful coexistence is possible, that the Kythera aren't mindless killers but fellow sapients trying to survive, we could end 3 centuries of war," Sarah finished. But their planning was interrupted by an urgent communication from the station's perimeter sensors. A massive fleet was approaching, ships from both the Federation and the Zephyrian Empire, flying in formation. Commander Valix, who had been living in exile on the station, analyzed the incoming vessels with growing concern. "That's not a joint operation," he said grimly. "Both fleets are armed for war. I think our governments have decided to solve the problem of this station permanently." Captain Rodriguez was studying the tactical display. 200 ships total, 50 Federation vessels, 70 Zephyrian, and the rest appear to be corporate security forces. "They're not here to negotiate?" Sarah felt despair wash over her. After months of breakthrough discoveries, it was all going to end in violence. The cubs, sensing the tension in the air, gathered around her, their large eyes filled with concern. But then Arya did something extraordinary. She walked to the center of the lab and began to sing, not the beautiful melodic songs they had grown accustomed to, but something deeper and more powerful. Her voice seemed to resonate through the station's hull, carrying across space itself. One by one, the other cubs joined her song. But this time, something different happened. The psychic abilities that Nova had been developing suddenly amplified, and the song became more than just sound. It became a telepathic transmission, reaching out across the galaxy to every Kythera mind capable of receiving it. Dr. Silvius was monitoring the communication arrays when the response came. "By the ancestors," he breathed. "I'm detecting psychic transmissions from 17 different star systems. They're all responding to the Cubs' call. On the main display, they could see the approaching fleets slowing their advance as their sensors detected something unexpected. Incoming ships from multiple directions. Not warships, but civilian vessels, cargo haulers, and small transport craft. Each one carried the distinctive energy signatures of Kythera life forms. "They're coming," Sarah whispered. "The lost populations are coming home." Over the next hour, dozens of ships arrived in the system. Their occupants were unlike the Cubs, larger, more scarred, with the hardened appearance of survivors. But when they saw the young ones singing from the station, something changed in their behavior. The first communication came from a battered transport ship that had traveled from the Outer Rim territories. The voice that emerged from the speakers was harsh and mechanical, but it spoke in standard, "Human scientists, we hear the song of children. Our children, the lost ones, sing the hope song of homecoming." Dr. Vasquez opened communications with all the arriving ships. "This is Research Station Harmony. We offer peaceful contact and scientific exchange. We seek understanding between all sapient species." The response came from multiple ships simultaneously, their voices harmonizing in a way that suggested they were sharing thoughts as they spoke. "We remember the time before war. We remember the dream of peace between kinds. If the human people can raise our children with love song instead of death cry, perhaps the dream can live again." Sarah looked at the 5 cubs who had started this revolution. They were still singing, their voices now joined by the distant voices of their people across space. It was a song of reunion, of hope, of the possibility that ancient wounds might finally begin to heal. The approaching military fleets had stopped their advance, their crews undoubtedly confused by the unexpected arrival of so many civilian vessels. For the first time in centuries, Federation, Zephyrian, and Kythera ships occupied the same space without firing a shot. Sarah realized that this was the moment that would determine the future of galactic civilization. Would fear and hatred win out, or would the song of 5 small cubs be enough to change the course of history? The Harmony Accords, as historians would later call them, were negotiated not in the sterile conference rooms of government buildings, but in the expanded habitat modules of a research station, with 5 young Kythera serving as living proof that peace was possible. Sarah stood before the assembled representatives of 3 civilizations, Federation admirals, Zephyrian war commanders, and Kythera collective speakers whose voices harmonized as they translated thoughts into words that other species could understand. Behind her, Arya was demonstrating her mathematical abilities to a group of stunned military observers, solving equations that had challenged xenobiologists for decades. "The evidence is undeniable," Sarah said, her voice carrying across the crowded station's main auditorium. "The Kythera are not our enemies. They never were. They are refugees, survivors of an ecological disaster that we helped create, driven to violence by desperation and trauma." Admiral Chen of the Federation fleet, no relation to Sarah despite the shared surname, was studying the genetic analysis reports with obvious discomfort. "Dr. Chen, even if we accept your findings about the cubs' peaceful nature, how can we trust that adult Kythera won't revert to their aggressive patterns?" The answer came not from Sarah, but from one of the Kythera speakers, an ancient individual whose scarred hide told the story of centuries of struggle. When she spoke, her words were translated by Echo, who had become remarkably skilled at bridging the communication gap between species. "The eldest speaker says that the war rage was never our true nature," Echo translated, his young voice carrying the weight of eons. "It was the pain madness of children who watched their world mother die. But the song memory remains. We remember the time when all people shared the starfields in peace. Commander Valix, who had been stripped of his rank but continued to serve as the Zephyrian representative, stepped forward. The question is not whether we can trust them. The question is whether we can trust ourselves to be worthy of their trust. The breakthrough moment came when Nova, using her developing psychic abilities, established a three-way mental connection between herself, a young Federation diplomat, and a Zephyrian cultural attaché. For 30 seconds, the three beings shared thoughts, emotions, and memories without the barriers of language or species prejudice. When the connection ended, both the human and Zephyrian were in tears. "I felt what she feels," the diplomat whispered. "The loneliness, the love for her siblings, the hope that someday she might see the stars that her people came from. She's not a monster. She's just a child who wants to go home." The Zephyrian attaché was nodding vigorously, and I sensed no deception, no hidden aggression. Her mind is as peaceful as her behavior suggests. Dr. Silvius had been documenting everything, and his findings were revolutionary. The psychic abilities don't just allow communication, they make deception almost impossible. A civilization of telepaths would have no choice but to develop radical honesty and empathy. The concept of war as we understand it would be foreign to them. Over the following weeks, as negotiations continued, the Cubs became unofficial ambassadors for their species. They worked with scientists, played with the children of station personnel, and gradually won over even the most skeptical military observers. Ripple, the quietest of the five, had formed a particularly strong bond with Dr. Vasquez's young daughter, Maria. The two could be seen playing together in the observation decks, the human child teaching the Kythera Cub games from Earth, while Ripple shared the harmonic songs of her people. "Look at them," Dr. Vasquez said to Sarah as they watched the children play. "That's what the future could look like. Not three separate species coexisting in armed neutrality, but genuine friendship and cooperation." The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when the eldest Kythera speaker shared the true history of their people's exodus from their homeworld. Using a combination of songs, psychic impressions, and ancient data crystals they had preserved, they painted a picture of a desperate people fleeing a dying world. "We did not seek to conquer," the eldest speaker communicated through Sage's translation. "We sought sanctuary. When your peoples met us with weapons instead of welcome, we thought all star children had become death singers. We fought because we knew no other choice." Admiral Chen was reviewing the historical records with new eyes. The first contact incidents. "We assumed they were attacks, but they were probably attempts at communication, and when we responded with force, you triggered a trauma response in a species that was already on the edge of extinction," Dr. Walsh finished. "Every battle, every colony lost, just reinforced their belief that the galaxy was hostile to their existence. The harmony accords that emerged from these revelations were unlike any treaty in galactic history. Rather than dividing territory or establishing spheres of influence, they created a framework for genuine interspecies cooperation. The first provision established a joint research program to develop terraforming techniques that could restore damaged worlds, starting with the Kythera homeworld, but extending to any planet that had suffered ecological collapse. The second created an interspecies communication protocol based on the Kythera psychic abilities, allowing for unprecedented levels of understanding between civilizations. The third, and perhaps most important, established the principle that no sapient species could be classified as inherently hostile based on the actions of traumatized or desperate individuals. As Sarah prepared to return to Earth with the Cubs, who had chosen to accompany her as part of the first Kythera diplomatic mission to the Federation capital, she reflected on how much had changed since that desperate escape from the burning research station. The Cubs were no longer cubs, really. In the months since their rescue, they had grown into young adults, though they would always be Sarah's children in her heart. They had learned to navigate between their natural telepathic communication and the verbal languages of other species. They had become bridges between worlds that had been at war for centuries. Arya approached Sarah as she packed her research notes. The young Kythera's silver fur now marked with the distinctive patterns that indicated adult status among her people. "Song Mother," Arya said in carefully practiced standard, supplementing her words with the musical undertones that carried deeper meaning. "We go to the star place where you hatched?" Sarah smiled, remembering when Arya could only communicate through chirps and clicks. Yes, we're going to Earth. You'll get to see where humans come from. Will the Earth people sing with us? I think they will, Sarah said, hoping she was right. I think the whole galaxy is ready to learn new songs. As their ship departed Harmony Station, Sarah looked back at the collection of vessels that still surrounded the facility. Federation cruisers, Zephyrian interceptors, and Kythera transports, all flying in formation like a symbol of the peace they had achieved. The nest had been burning when she rescued 5 helpless cubs, but from those ashes something beautiful had emerged. Not just the survival of a species, but the birth of a new kind of civilization. One based on understanding rather than fear, cooperation rather than competition. In her arms, the newest addition to their expanding family, a tiny Kythera cub born on the station to one of the rescued adults, slept peacefully. This little one would grow up in a galaxy where her people were no longer feared as monsters, but welcomed as partners in the great adventure of exploring the stars. The future was uncertain, as all futures are. There would be challenges, setbacks, and those who would resist the changes that peace would bring. But for the first time in centuries, the galaxy had something it had almost forgotten how to feel: hope. And it had all started with one human woman who refused to let children die, even when those children belonged to a species the galaxy called monsters. Sometimes, Sarah reflected, the greatest revolutions begin with the smallest acts of compassion. The song of the Kythera echoed through space, no longer a lament for the lost, but a celebration of the found. And throughout the galaxy, other species were learning to sing along.